This podcast was recorded on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present. This episode contains strong language and adult themes. Hi everyone, welcome to the penultimate episode of this first series of the Nature Disturbed podcast, Wet and Wild. I'm sat in my kitchen sink wearing a bright yellow raincoat and I'm wearing a salmon hat, by which I mean I've put some smoked salmon on my head. Yes, I know, it's wasteful, but I really felt I had to succumb to the peer pressure of Canadian killer whales. They're very fashionable, you know, and they reckon salmon hats are in. Let's kick off today with a couple of quotes from Dante's Inferno. So many voices issued through those trunks. Men once we were, and now are changed to trees. Indeed, thy hand should be more pitiful, even if the souls of serpents we had been. A haunting image. Trees made of humans. Imagine walking through a forest and seeing a tree with Katy Perry's face on it. Well, to a salmon, the coastal temperate rainforests of British Columbia may well be a haunting image. An ancient woodland, which somehow is built from the bodies of a fish that spends most of its life at sea. It's the story of an epic migration, the mixing of land and water, and the blurring of the line between life and death. And it's a tale that is inextricably linked to place, and so I'm not going to hesitate to hand you back to my past self. Oh, sorry, I hesitated. I travelled to British Columbia, Canada, to meet Kristen Walters, Director of Salmon Habitat, Climate and Policy at Raincoast. Hello. I'm walking along the banks of the Fraser River, British Columbia, on the west coast of Canada. I'm meeting Kristen somewhere nearby. I should bump into her any moment now. I got here a little bit early. It's important to make a good impression when you're meeting someone new. If you're on time, you're late. So the saying goes. It's good to get there 15 minutes early, so they say. Well, I think I may have taken it a little far. I got here 3 weeks ago. I was planning on pitching a tent and doing some bird spotting while I waited, but I forgot my birding book and my binoculars. I also forgot the tent, so I've just been sleeping on a little patch of ground next to a fallen log. I'm not complaining about all this. It was certainly a unique experience. Anyway, here we are. The time has finally come to meet Kristen. I won't give too much of a vivid description about my surroundings because I'd like to ask Kristen to paint that picture. But this part of the world is a temperate rainforest, so it's very green and very wet. Like my underwear after sleeping in a rainforest for 3 weeks. I'm sorry that's disgusting, but it's true. Throughout this season, we've looked at the relationship between life and water, and that analysis has often taken place in an environment like the very bottom of the sea, or in a lake. The story of the salmon of British Columbia is perhaps the best story to express one eternal truth. The water and the land are not two discrete entities. They merge and combine, with every rise and fall of the tide, with the flow of the river into the sea, and with every time a new generation of salmon decides to return to their spawning grounds. In episode 5 of this season, Eels Under Melbourne, Dr. Alex Faustino walked us through the migration of the eel. These creatures grow up in lakes and rivers, then depart from their freshwater homes to undergo long migrations, which are one way, spawning in the ocean at the end of their journey before dying. You can think of the salmon migration as the opposite. They hatch in streams and rivers, before moving to the sea where they spend most of their lives. After many years, they return to the very spot where they were born, having to climb waterfalls and evade the jaws of grizzly bears to get there, before they spawn and die. Some close contenders for the title of this episode were Zombie Salmon, The Great Salmon Run, and The Dark Side of Horses. I can see now that the last one was too off topic. In the end, I chose the title Trees Made of Salmon, because the migration of salmon inland brings with it a huge influx of nutrients. So much salmon ends up on land that it changes the very biochemical composition of the forest. I want to know how. That's why I'm here. And I want to learn more about this unique environment. But I'm not sure where exactly I'm meeting Kristen. Kristen? Kristen? I hope there aren't any mountain lions in the forest called Kristen. Oh wait, I see her. Kristen the human. She's seen me. She's waiting by the side of a river. She's dancing, covered in blue paint. Interesting. I'm sure there's a reason. What time is it? Let's check my watch. Oh my gosh, I've been rambling for so long. I'm 5 minutes late. So much for making a good first impression. Kristen, hi.
Hi.
We've just run into each other along the banks of the Fraser River here in British Columbia as we planned. How wonderful. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you? It's great to bump into you.
We knew we were doing this, but it's also a surprise to find
Hmm.
someone so deep in the middle of the rainforest. I hope you don't mind me saying, but you're a salmon person.
Hmm.
I thought that we could maybe start with just a warm-up question. Um,
Hmm.
it's just a nice, easy question, and it's multiple choice to get us
Right.
into the swing of things. So, what is your name? Is it A, Helen Rogers, B, Kristen Walters, or C, Annabelle Thwaites?
I'm gonna have to go with B. I hope I'm right.
I actually am not sure on this one. I wrote the question, but I didn't get an answer list prepared. So I guess we'll move on to question two, which is how did you become a salmon person?
I've spent a lot of time thinking about this question because I think for many of us who become salmon people, it happens really organically. When I was growing up, I never thought of becoming a salmon biologist. It wasn't on my life to-do list. And I got introduced to salmon later in life when I was going to university and living on the coast of British Columbia and Vancouver. And I think living on the BC coast and really throughout the west coast of North America, because Pacific salmon range from about California all the way up the coast of the US and Canada, Alaska, all the way to Russia and beyond. Living in this geographical area, it's hard not to notice salmon because they're really kind of the lifeblood of this coast in that they have supported communities, indigenous and non-indigenous communities for so long. Maybe I'll go into a little bit about salmon and their life cycle because I think that's so important to this story and how I became a salmon person. But for those who might not be aware, salmon, Pacific salmon, they're a group of 5 species. And they have this really like wondrous life cycle where they're born in the freshwater in rivers and streams. And depending on the species and the population, they hang out in the freshwater growing and until they're about 2 or 3 inches long, these cute little minnow looking like fish. And then they swim out to an estuary where they spend a bit more time feeding and growing. And then as these very small fish, they undertake this big migration up into the North Pacific where BC salmon swim up towards Alaska and over towards Russia and do this big circle essentially in the North Pacific over multiple years before they come back to the exact same river that they were born in. And in that time, they've grown, 2 or 3 feet. They weigh many more pounds. They've evaded predators, they've foraged, and they come back to the same stream or river that they were born in. And for the people who have lived on this coast for millennia and more recently with settlers in the last couple hundred years, it's this huge nutrient pulse that supports people and ecosystems. And because the salmon come back every year, they've really informed the cultural identity of this region For First Nations, salmon are so central to their culture, their language, their ceremony, their way of being, their wellness. And for settlers, it's a more recent relationship, but also really important. And so I think when you live on this coast, it's almost impossible not to become a salmon person. But I went even deeper than that, and I did my master's degree in science in biology on Pacific salmon, and now I'm fortunate that my work is centered around salmon. So I was extremely fortunate to grow up in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, but now it's really beautiful because I live in the Columbia River Basin in British Columbia, which is a large river, a transboundary river that flows. Its headwaters are in the mountains of BC, and it flows south into the US. And the river that I grew up on in the Yellowstone area was the Snake River, and the Snake River is one of the biggest tributaries of the Columbia. And so even though I'm in Canada and Canadian and my life is here, I'm still connected to my home and my family through shared waters in the Columbia River Basin. Yeah, that's kind of the arc of how I became a salmon person.
That's beautiful. I guess all roads lead to salmon in your part of the world.
Yeah, very true.
How would you describe the environment that you're currently living and working in? Because it's a rainforest
Hmm.
and it's in Canada, which
Hmm.
I suspect many people would be surprised by.
Yeah. So we have two rainforests. We have the coastal temperate rainforest, and we also have the inland temperate rainforest. The inland temperate rainforest where I live is amazing because in between the coast of BC and where I live near the Rocky Mountains, there's a semi-arid desert. Essentially, there's dry grassland ecosystems, there's dry pine ecosystems. And so it's this incredible shift between the coastal temperate rainforest and then you go into almost like a semi-arid desert environment, and then you cross another big mountain range and you're back into the temperate rainforest. Historically, there would be salmon here too through the Columbia River, which I mentioned. So we would have, even though we're thousands of kilometers from the ocean, really large Chinook salmon, which is a species I can talk about more, would be in the headwaters of these big mountains, returning as, 100-pound fish after they spent 7 years at sea. The Columbia was dammed in the 20th century for flood control and hydropower generation. And so we haven't had anadromous or ocean-going salmon in a long time. But the coast is so magical. I mean, kind of, if I could liken it to a popular culture reference, like if you envisioned what being in Jurassic Park would feel like,
Oh my God.
that's kind of what it's like, where it's just there's so much life. It's so green, it's lush, it's not hot like tropical rainforest. We have really incredible understories. Vegetation's really big fern, lots of moss, lichen. And in old growth forests, you have these huge, huge trees that are, hundreds of years old. Western cedar, Douglas fir, Sitka spruce, and they're just saying these really rich ecosystems in terms of biodiversity. They support so many species, large and small. I mean, we have grizzly bears, we have coastal wolves, which are these really unique subspecies of gray wolves that forage in the intertidal area and on marine organisms. They're smaller than their gray wolf counterpart in the Rocky Mountains and elsewhere in North America, but they live in harmony with the marine environment. And you have black bears and mountain lions, and then the ocean itself, because the waters are colder, are so productive. And so there's just so much life. There's whales and porpoises and seals and sea lions. And I mean, it's incredible. So yeah, I think when people think of a rainforest, they don't think of cold Canada and, cold water. The temperate rainforests of BC are really special and globally unique.
Yeah. So the environment there, the life
Hmm.
living there, which is so abundant and diverse, is completely defined by this interaction between the sea and the land.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think salmon are such a representative kind of life force of that because they do have this life history and this life cycle that takes them from the land to the sea and back again. And Chinook salmon, they have some of the longest migration routes. There's a population of Chinook salmon in the Yukon River, and they have to go through Alaska into the Yukon, which is a northern province of Canada. And their migration route is 3,000 kilometers long, and they gain a lot of elevation as well. They're just these incredible testaments to how connected our landscapes are with the ocean, even though it might not be apparent to our eye, but they provide that lifeblood connection.
Yeah. I realized that we followed one another down so many really fascinating little loops there. I think it's important to ask what your role is at Raincoast and what do you guys do?
Yeah. So, Raincoast Conservation Foundation is a science-based NGO based on the coast of BC. And we use this really unique model of informed advocacy to protect land, water, and wildlife in coastal BC. And that model is really based on the using technical expertise in science and collaboration with Indigenous communities. And so we do a lot of peer-reviewed research. We publish that research. We collaborate with folks, spanning academia and government and communities to really advance efforts to recover at-risk coastal species and their habitats. And to do this, we have a couple of aspects of our organization that's really unique. We have an applied conservation science lab in the University of Victoria. So we have a university-based research lab that we can support graduate students in doing a lot of research, and the staff, we do research as well. We also have a conservation genetics lab, and so we have an in-house geneticist. We can actually, in doing our research, learn more about species and populations from a genetic standpoint that can really inform the work we do on the ground. And then we also have a 68-foot sailboat, a vessel that operates as a research vessel as well. And so a lot of my colleagues that are cetacean researchers, they go out in the marine environment sailing for multiple weeks at a time, and they're able to use hydrophones and drones and other types of technology to gather data on different endangered whale species and populations to inform recovery measures for those animals. And so we really use and draw upon Western science in collaboration with Indigenous knowledge and other ways of knowing. So that's Raincoast. And then my role, I direct our habitat, climate, and policy work for the salmon program. And so if anyone who's worked for a nonprofit knows you wear many hats, and that's the beauty of it. It's always exciting. But I really focus on how different land use practices like forestry and logging, development, industrialization affect freshwater salmon habitat. And in particular, I've increasingly focused on how wildfires affect hydrology and salmon habitat, and where Canada is having increasingly more severe, high severity fires that are affecting watersheds that support drinking water for people, but also salmon. And so my role is to really think about what happens on the landscape in our mountains and our floodplains and our forests, and how does that affect water for salmon that rely on it, but also communities that need drinking water. And so I conduct research on that, support restoration on the ground, but also engage decision makers at the provincial and federal level to think about how we can better support our ecosystems and our communities into the future as climate change advances and we have challenges from drought and fire and things like that.
Oh, what great work. So you wear many hats.
Hmm.
Have you ever worn a salmon hat?
Not a literal salmon hat, but I would like a salmon hat.
And well, I suppose the reason I asked that question is because orcas in your part of the world, as far as I know, have been doing that. So that's
Yeah.
an unusual example of the way that salmon interact with their marine environment.
Okay. I'm glad you brought that up. Salmon support the marine ecosystem in a number of ways, both as predators and prey. And so They occupy this really central role where they link lower and higher trophic levels, basically different levels of the food web. They feed on zooplankton and krill and squid and forage fish like herring. And then in turn, they're foraged on by marine predators and marine mammals like southern resident killer whales, sea lions, seals, seabirds, etc. And so for southern resident killer whales, they're this population of resident killer whale, which are fish-eating killer whales. We also have marine mammal-eating killer whales, which are called transient killer whales. But it's the residents that you've seen wear a salmon hat,
Mhm.
and their primary prey are Chinook salmon. And so earlier I mentioned there's 5 species of Pacific salmon. Chinook are the largest bodied salmon, and they're also the fattiest. And they're the fattiest because historically and continue to have the longest migration routes. So I mentioned that one Chinook population that migrates 3,000 kilometers, they have to build up big fat stores and energy reserves to be able to do that migration route. So if you're a killer whale who eats salmon, you want to eat the biggest, fattiest fish. So these killer whales selectively forage on Chinook. However, over the last several decades, Chinook have been in decline, which has caused the southern resident killer whale population to become nutritionally stressed. And this has really limited their ability to successfully reproduce. And they also face other threats. The two other primary threats to that population are underwater noise from vessels, from shipping, which interrupts their ability to use echolocation to communicate with each other and to forage as a group. And then also contaminants from vessels and land have affected the viability of pregnancies, even because it accumulates in their bloodstream and can be toxic for developing fetuses. So southern residents face a lot of challenges, and they're also probably the most culturally important whale of BC. For British Columbians, and for First Nations, there's so much rich relationship and history with killer whales and southern residents in particular. As a region, both in British Columbia and in Washington, we share this inland sea called the Sailor Sea, and that's where Southern residents hang out in the majority of the time. But it's also a sea that's kind of surrounded by Vancouver in BC and Seattle in Washington. So it's quite densely populated, and as a result, it's kind of like an urban sea. And so it poses a lot of challenges for the killer whales who evolved in that ecosystem to eat abundant, big, fatty Chinook salmon with no contaminants in the marine environment and no vessel noise. And so because killer whales have this really rich language and cultural identity, they speak a different dialogue. Like they literally, two different populations of resident whales. There's a northern resident killer whale population. They don't speak and communicate in the same language in terms of their clicks and the noises that they make. And so they can't really communicate. They don't have the same language. And all of that and their behavior, their foraging behavior is passed down in their matriline. So they're a matriarchal culture. And so the grandmothers of the pod will teach all the generations and younger whales where to forage and where's safe. And as the population continues to decline, they lose that cultural knowledge. There's been a big push by British Columbians and Washingtonians and folks from across Canada and the US to recover these whales. They're listed under Canada Species at Risk Act. They're also listed under the US Endangered Species Act. But there hasn't really been any meaningful recovery of the population. And one really important context piece is that these were the whales, this was the population of whales that were captured back in the 70s for marine entertainment parks and things like that. So SeaWorld and in Marineland and other captivity parks for entertainment. And so they lost a number of individuals from their population because they were captured and put into tanks. And so I think the population, because they're so long-lived and their pregnancies are so long, and now they're facing these additional threats of being nutritionally stressed with contaminants and underwater noise, they really haven't caught a break. They haven't recovered. And so our organization and many others are really trying to advance this recovery, but there's a lot of challenges ahead, unfortunately.
Hmm. Maybe they even lost some of their cultural knowledge when they had a bunch of them
Hmm.
taken out of the wild.
Yeah, my colleagues at Raincoast work on killer whales and have for many decades, and they're a wealth of knowledge. But I think what is also challenging is that cultural piece, like you said, and the loss of it is I think we can relate to them in many ways because they do have family bonds, and they have shared language and shared culture and shared learning, and even the females go through menopause, like human females. And so there's, I think, a lot of familiarity between humans and killer whales and being intelligent mammals. And so it's really hard to, watch these whales continue to decline and there's the question mark of extinction. And so it definitely motivates us every day to show up at work to support these whales and advance their recovery.
Yeah. So I guess in conclusion then, the reason they're wearing salmon hats is because they're a bit weird and no one's taught them how to be normal, and that's what happens. And we see that in people.
Yeah, and they do, there's a lot of like play behavior and foraging and shared resources. Like there's some incredible drone footage of killer whales. They'll hunt Chinook and they'll share it amongst each other. So because of that kind of collective foraging that they do, there's a lot of sharing of Chinook. And so I think sometimes they end up on their heads.
Yeah, things happen. So salmon themselves are really a very important species living in the oceans because they fall right in between a bunch of different trophic levels.
Hmm.
How are they interacting with animals on land?
Hmm. So I think this is one of the most magical things about salmon, and it's something that indigenous nations and communities have known forever. And of course, the Western scientists do research and they're like, oh, we found salmon in trees. And they're like, we could have told you that. We've known that forever. But like, welcome to knowing this information. But there's been some incredible research in how salmon influence and benefit aquatic and terrestrial species kind of in the once they leave the ocean and return to their rivers. And so there's an estimate, and I think it's much higher than this, that salmon support 190 species. But again, I think because they have indirect and direct effects, I think it's much higher. But what essentially happens is that when adult salmon are going to their natal rivers to spawn, they move upstream and they reproduce. The females lay their eggs. They dig these kind of gravel nests in the riverbank. They're called redds, and they use their tail. They kind of turn sideways in water and they flap their tail really quickly. And it basically like blows out this beautiful, it clears all the sediment and it makes this really nice gravel nest. And then she lays her eggs in that nest and then she goes slightly upriver and again like flaps her tail and uses gravel slightly upstream to cover her eggs. And she will remain over that nest in the water until she dies. And so after she lays her eggs, her body is basically slowly shutting down, but she will defend the nest. And sorry, I should have said the males, after a female lays her eggs, a male will come really quickly over the nest and release milt, sperm to fertilize the eggs. And so you see, when you see salmon in a river, they're kind of doing this courtship dance where a male will compete with other males to be able to access and fertilize those eggs. And so the males can be quite combative. They'll kind of, wrestle each other in the water, they'll bite each other. And so a male will gain the right to fertilize the eggs. And so a female lays her eggs in the gravel nest, male releases his milt right after, and then she buries the eggs. And so the eggs then incubate in the fresh water over the winter. The spawning usually happens in the fall months, late summer to fall, and then the eggs are incubating in the riverbed. After the adults complete that reproductive stage, their bodies slowly shut down and they die. And their carcasses start to decompose and are basically sucked up by everything in the ecosystem. They're either eaten directly by bears or other mammals, birds, bald eagles, seagulls. So they're either consumed directly or as their carcasses decompose, they start to release these marine derived nutrients that are absorbed into the ecosystem. And so this kind of classic relationship is really exemplified by black bears and grizzly bears that will go into the river and catch a salmon, and then they'll bring the carcass into the riparian area, which is kind of like the forest right on the riverbank. And they will, chomp on the salmon and they'll selectively eat some of it. Wolves will only eat the brains of the salmon as a way to avoid parasites that can be in other parts of the salmon. Bears are not picky, so they'll just eat any part of the fish. It's really obvious, like when you're walking the creek or the river, you can see where a wolf has eaten a fish compared to, or, caught a fish. And then just like there's like maybe like a cookie-sized chunk of the salmon gone from the top of its head where the wolf has eaten the brain. And they're also, the brains are also really fatty and nutrient dense. Whereas the bear is kind of like torn open its belly, and if it's a female, they love to eat the eggs, which are also nutrient rich. So the bear will eat, or the wolf, or a different species will eat the fish, and then they leave the carcass there. And so the carcass will get fed on, it'll be foraged by bald eagles and seagulls and other scavengers, and they'll fight over it. And it's this big dramatic, like, scavenger battle. There could be hundreds of salmon scattered on the riverbank from foragers, from predators or different scavengers. And so it can get really stinky. Like when we're counting salmon, sometimes it's like very stinky. But all of these fish decompose, and even like little bugs and insects and invertebrates consume the carcass. And then they transfer this big pulse of, they're called marine derived nutrients, but it's all the nutrients that salmon basically gather during their time growing at sea. It's often like nitrogen and phosphorus, carbon. Over time, as they decompose, gets absorbed and uptaken by plants in the ecosystem through the soil. And so there's been incredible studies done looking at marine derived nitrogen and phosphorus in trees. There's a chemical signature, stable isotopes, but without getting into like the biochemistry in it, it's a marine signature of these nutrients. There are terrestrial versions of these nutrients, but chemically you can really see that this came from the marine environment. And so trees and other plants like suck these nutrients right up. And trees that are on the stream banks of salmon-bearing rivers grow faster than in systems where there aren't salmon. And so they're this like nutrient pulse for so many animal species, plant species, and beyond. Yeah, it's amazing.
The trees are made of salmon.
Yeah, they really are.
Over time, are the marine derived nutrients making their way further into the forest? So is it just the trees right on the riverbank, or is it the case that after, I don't know how old this forest is, perhaps salmon's just fully part of the ecosystem?
I think because salmon have been, Pacific salmon as they are, really evolved after the last ice age and colonized new habitats that became available as glaciers retreated in North America and the kind of the northern rim. I think salmon are so integral to these ecosystems for the last like 12,000 years. In terms of how far they go into a system or a watershed, different scavengers, if like birds, will carry pieces of carcasses further inland. So often in the scavenger battle that I talked about earlier, the salmon will be essentially ripped apart by eagles or seagulls, and they often will fly away with their chunk of salmons and then land on a tree and perch and kind of consume what's left of their chunk, and they often drop the remaining bones or cartilage onto the ground. And that can be quite like a ways into the watershed or up the system. And so They're probably the most mobile species in terms of how these salmon nutrients get carried into the land further in the forest further. So it's common to find, salmon bones pretty far into forests that bird species carry and things like that. So yeah, I mean, it's amazing to see this connection and how salmon fuel the forest.
Yeah. It's just so funny to me imagining finding a dead salmon kilometers away from the river in the middle of a forest. It would be very confusing if you didn't have any knowledge about it.
Yeah, it is. I think it would be like chunks of things. And then before you know it, by the next fall, those bones have been covered in detritus and litter and leaf litter. And so you can dig through the soil and still find salmon bones, especially under like perch trees, like bald eagle perch trees, for example, or nests, like if they're used year after year. You can see the layers of the years of these salmon being foraged on. And so it's just kind of this continual system of nutrients that are provided.
I think maybe salmon in the way that they sort of come on to land to mate and die, as well as representing the interaction between life and water. They also blur the line between life and death in this really interesting
Hmm.
way.
Hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think there are species that after they reproduce, they die. And it is this kind of really incredible feat that they go through to be able to reproduce for the next generation. And they make this arduous migration journey and they're battling their way back upriver and then once they spawn they do die and I agree it's not only that like they kind of live to reproduce and die but they also their death provides and gives life to so much life on land and in the water and so I think that's also how they blur it is like in their death they also feed and support so many others.
Am I right in thinking that when they are in this sort of half dead, half alive state, they're almost living as zombies in the sense that they're like bacteria ridden and fungal even?
Hmm. Yeah, they do look like zombies. Straight up. Their skin starts to develop a fungus, and so they can look really, it's almost like patchwork discoloration, and they stop feeding once they leave the ocean environment. And so they also are just existing on their energy reserves that they've built up in the marine phase. So they are basically zombies. They're essentially just slowly dying. And the goal for them is to complete that spawning process, that to release their eggs and their milt to create the next generation. And so, yeah, they do look and act like and are literal zombies in a sense because they're just slowly dying and not eating. And they have a one-track mind, and that is reproduction.
Yes, it's a lovely image, a decaying, and there's some of them are bright red, aren't they? Is that the sockeye salmon?
Yeah, that's the sockeye. They do, so when they leave the ocean and enter fresh water, they transition into their spawning colors. So in the ocean, they're silver. And when they enter the marine or the freshwater environment, they transition into their spawning colors. And they're beautiful, gorgeous. Like sockeye are bright red, they have the green heads. Coho are a little bit darker as are Chinook. They have kind of like a very subtle tinge of red, but it's very subtle. And same with Chinook. And then Chum developed these stripes, these really cool looking, almost like tiger stripes on their side. And they
Wow.
also grow these big teeth. And they're also called dog salmon because the kype, which is their mouth, it for the males, it becomes their upper jawbone becomes really hooked, and they grow these teeth. And they're not like super sharp teeth, but they're nicknamed dog salmon because they have teeth. They develop a hump, as do pink salmon. The males of pink and sockeye salmon have humps. So, and pinks are the smallest. They're very cute. And they're also doing the best right now. They seem to be, I wouldn't say like partying and enjoying climate change, but they seem to be doing okay with it and warmer temperatures.
Good for
So
them.
we've actually, yeah, good for them. we've seen an increase in pink salmon in the last handful of years. So we're not sure what is causing that. There's a number of kind of potential hypotheses, but they seem to be doing okay versus chum and chinook and coho and I mean others are not. So yeah, they become these really beautiful fish and then they start to develop the fungus and become zombies essentially.
Yes, 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 lovely.
Hmm.
I also wonder if we know much about how they are able to home, how they're able to make their way back from the ocean to sometimes the exact place that they were spawned.
Hmm. Yeah, it's basically comes down to the equivalent of like a sense of smell. It's complex, but it's a chemical signature that they pick up in their natal streams where they're born. And they're essentially able to trace that back towards their natal stream. It's incredible. Honestly, it's like a marvel of this world because
Yeah.
I think they have a general like migratory sense of returning to the river, but then sometimes they even return to like within a few meters of where they were born. It's incredible. So they're another migratory species that just embark on these epic quests.
Yeah, epic's the word.
Hmm.
Wow. And you mentioned that you incorporate First Nations knowledge
Hmm.
into
Hmm.
your work. So I'm wondering how you do that and also how salmon are part of culture
Hmm.
among First Nations communities.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't want to speak on behalf of the nations in terms of how salmon are in so embedded in culture and language and ceremony. I've been privileged to be invited to the first salmon ceremony by some colleagues and friends in a nation in the Lord Fraser region where it's the first salmon that returns to the river that's harvested, and it's this incredible community ceremony that everyone gets to eat a bit of the salmon and really come together and honor the salmon and thank it for coming and returning to the river, and then they release the bones back into the river to kind of support the salmon and give more life and so I think there's so many examples of how salmon are part of indigenous cultures up and down the coast. And in how we collaborate with indigenous folks, I think is really focused on building relationships and happening slowly. I think relationship building takes time and needs to happen organically and you share meals and you learn about each other's families. And I think we're very intentional in taking that approach of like, let's do this together from the outset. And I think Western scientists have been very good at doing parachute science, where they parachute into a community and extract information on people or ecosystems, and then go run away and publish a paper in academia. And it's very self-serving and it exploits a community. And so for Raincoast's whole history, the organization is 30 years old. I think it's been, yeah, really grounded in that like slow, continual, trust-based relationship building. One of the examples of how Indigenous knowledge is used and incorporated into policy around salmon is some work we've been really fortunate to do with our collaborators and friends at the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance, which is an Indigenous-led organization in the Lower Fraser region of BC, which is kind of in and around Metro Vancouver. It's this really complex area because it's right where the Fraser River, which is where we're standing on the banks of
Mhm.
the
Of course.
Fraser, where it drains into the ocean, into the Sailor Sea. This watershed, the Fraser River watershed, drains 1/3 of British Columbia. It's this huge watershed. And the lower part of the river, before it meets the sea, it's also where the majority of British Columbia's population lives. So it's this kind of intersection of, a city, a metropolitan area, and a big river with its tributaries and a really big floodplain. In this area, it's also the main kind of artery for all salmon populations in that big watershed. They go up and down the river. When they're
Mm.
adults, they go back, and when they're juveniles, they come out. And so it's really critical to many, many populations. And it's also the home of 30 First Nations, over 30 First Nations. And so This organization, the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance, are a voice for those 30 nations. And over the last, I think we started collaborating in like 2016, but we have this working group where we are really thinking about how do we support the nations in this area in implementing ecosystem-based and indigenous-led governance for salmon habitat. And so our other collaborators, West Coast Environmental Law, they have this, they're a nonprofit environmental law group. They have this amazing program called RELAW, and it stands for Revitalizing Indigenous Law for Land, Air, and Water. They work with First Nations, and it's also an Indigenous-led program to listen to the community and from elders and the stories that are told about their territories and the land and the river and the species. And through that like storytelling, the lawyers work with the community members to identify Indigenous legal principles that are embedded in the stories and the lessons of oral history. And those legal principles are assembled and basically incorporated into ecosystem-based management. And so that nations can refer to their own law, their own story, their own teachings in how they manage ecosystems and how they work towards salmon recovery. And so instead of it being kind of driven by colonial law and, the federal provincial law that relates to land or development or fisheries, whatever it may be, it's really rooted in Indigenous law and the community's history and culture. And so that's been a really wonderful collaboration. And I'm honored to call everyone dear friends, but and also thinking like how can we support as Western scientists from the backseat? Like when there's need or desire for Western science, we're happy to provide it, but really how can you collaborate across disciplines too with like law and indigenous science and story to advance salmon recovery. So that's been a really amazing piece of work. And over the years, this indigenous-led organization, the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance, has grown and now has so much capacity to support the nations doing the work. So it's been really amazing to see that evolution as well.
Wow, yeah. So you're kind of helping build like a legal framework that you can then refer back to. That,
Yeah, exactly. And it's a resource for the community, for community members to refer to and to apply it in how they want in terms of managing the landscape in their territory.
I I would also like to know how you personally connect with salmon on an individual basis, and in particular, please will you talk me through the process of making art out of salmon carcasses? Because I can't
Yeah.
stop thinking about it.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. Yeah, I started thinking about making art out of salmon a handful of years ago, and I was inspired by the style of art from Japan where fishermen would make prints out of their catch and of fish, and it's just so beautiful. And so I was spending, a decent amount of time on rivers doing field work for my job, but also a decent amount of time on my computer. And I think for anyone who works, at the desk, I think it's easy to become disconnected from, especially for me, like what I'm doing is out there. Like it's in the river. It might be close, it might be far, but the natural world is what my whole work is focused on. And so I think the more time I spent on my computer, the more disconnected I felt from the salmon conservation work I was doing. And so I was like, I think I just need to go make some art out of these salmon. And admittedly, they can be a little slimy, I will say. You really need to catch the carcasses ideally, right after they've finished spawning and have died. And so I just kind of started experimenting. I brought some biodegradable ink to the river and I would make all the prints on the riverbank. And I would just kind of cover the salmon with ink and paint them with ink. And then I experimented with different mediums like rice paper, which is the traditional Japanese method, or I started using canvas, raw canvas. And because I'm doing it on the riverbank, sometimes these salmon have been eagles have got their talons in them. Sometimes they're a little bloody, sometimes they're so it was a learning process. But I really love just making a print out of the body of the salmon. And it was kind of a way to honor them too. Like we mentioned earlier, they really blur this line of life and death and they really give back so much to the ecosystems. And so for me too, it was a nice way just to kind of bring that forward. And I have made quite a few different prints, and I still have so many that I kind of have in my closet and I need to finish. But there's a few hanging around our place. And yeah, so it was a really interesting journey of just thinking about how I can better connect with my whole focus of my job of salmon conservation and how I can do that on the riverbank.
Do you have a favorite piece of salmon art that you've made?
I do. Well, I'm kind of torn because my first piece was of a Chinook salmon, and I kind of stumbled upon this incredible, huge Chinook that had spawned. It wasn't slimy, it was in great shape. It was my first time making a print, and the print just came out really beautifully. Like it came out really detailed. There's kind of this balance between if you put too much ink on the carcass, it just looks like a blob, like it's just a
Mm.
fish-shaped blob. So you kind of have to nuance and finesse the amount of ink that you have on the carcass because then you can really pick up like the scale detail and the fins and the eye, and you really see the characteristics of the individual fish.
Mm.
And this first print just turned out really beautifully. And so I made a couple copies, or not copies, but with my rice paper that I had in the river, I had several of them. And one of them, I had done like a lighter application of ink. And so you could see the detail, but it was like this really light kind of version of the print. And so then I used some watercolors to actually like paint the spawning colors of the Chinook.
Mm.
So it's kind of this deep red, dark color. And so that might be my favorite just because, and my brother happened to be out visiting. And so we were out on the river together, and that was really special. And then I also have my other favorite would probably be I found this female coho that was just like chef's kiss. Like she must have just finished spawning and died because her colors were just so vibrant and gorgeous and like iridescent and because coho are a bit smaller, especially females, I was able to make multiple prints in the same canvas so it looks like a school of salmon. And so I really like that one as well, just because it's slightly different, but it was another amazing day on the river.
I love it. It's a very unique activity, I think.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, it did. It felt really, I think, unique to the work and just and what I do, and yeah, it was a nice way to kind of express creativity.
yeah, and to connect with the salmon there in a way that well that can you can
Hmm.
then take with you. Can I
Hmm.
ask, how do you stop it? How do you stop the painting from smelling?
So I would wipe, this is a great question. I would wipe the salmon down with like a little towel. And I wouldn't use carcasses that were like obviously decomposing. I tried once and it was like it was very gross. So I would wipe the carcass down, and so it was more or less like a blank slate, and then roll the ink on. So it wasn't slimy or stinky. Any carcasses that were just like, yeah, along their decomposition journey, I wouldn't use.
Yeah, okay, okay. Practical things to think about when producing salmon art.
Yes.
So, what are some of the challenges that salmon are facing in your part of the world?
Yeah, there's a number of them. So, salmon, we call them cumulative effects because salmon face multiple challenges, both historically, previously, currently, and in the future, that interact in ways that really add on to each other. And so, historically, after the arrival of settlers, and since there's been overfishing and pretty high fishing pressure on salmon populations that have been one of the main drivers of their decline. There's also been a lot of habitat loss and degradation from development, urbanization, forestry, mining, agriculture, extracting water from rivers, but also converting riparian areas. And then the marine environment, there's been changing marine temperature and ocean conditions, prey availability. So salmon really go through it. Like we've thrown a lot at them. Thankfully, they're one of the most incredibly resilient groups of species. They do have a big challenge ahead in terms of climate change because it will really amplify current stressors. And so, for example, when salmon are migrating and returning as adults to their rivers, and when juveniles are rearing and growing up in these rivers, climate change has shifted the amount of precipitation that we're getting in BC. We're having droughts, longer periods during the summer months without rain, hotter river temperatures, and lower stream flow. And this is posing a real challenge for salmon because they're cold water species. They have pretty clear thermal thresholds around 25, 26 degrees Celsius. Higher than that, we have seen them live, but they're really adversely affected in terms of their kind of immune systems, their ability to reproduce, metabolic function. They're not thriving when it's 25 degrees. They really like cold water. 10, 11 degrees is great. As you get up towards like 6, 17, 18 degrees, they're going to start to be stressed. And so as climate change marches along and we have hotter, drier summers, we are seeing salmon really experience that in rivers. And so they can be stressed and kind of physically disadvantaged when they're then going out into the marine environment. On the flip side, a couple of studies that have come out from colleagues at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, they looked at glacial retreat that's happening in northern British Columbia and southeastern Alaska. And as these glaciers retreat, there will be new salmon habitat opening up in the form of rivers and streams and floodplains. And the water will remain cooler than it will in southern British Columbia or in the States, where we're experiencing the effects of climate change that much sooner. And so, even though it's really unfortunate that our glaciers are retreating, that has many ripple effects, it's kind of this almost spot of hope and resilience for salmon because they are so adaptable. When habitat is available, they will occupy it. And so, I think salmon populations in northern latitudes will do a bit better because there is less human pressure. There's certainly plenty of fishing pressure further north, but there's less development pressure. There is, unfortunately, there's already mining stakes that are happening on these glaciers that are anticipated to retreat. And so mines are trying to take advantage of this new land that will become exposed when these glaciers retreat. And so that will be a big challenge to contend with, that even though new rivers will be formed, mining for minerals and things like that are already looking at that as well. So, yeah, there's a lot of challenges facing salmon. It's a similar story of our times. It's like, kind of corporate industrial interests versus ecosystems and species at risk, but we're trying our best.
Yeah, I think you're doing an excellent job.
Thanks.
Are you hopeful?
I am hopeful. I think, and it was actually a colleague who said maybe a few months ago when we were doing field work, he's like, I feel really lucky to work on salmon because they'll always be salmon. They're so resilient. And I was like, wow, that really struck me because I think it's easy as a biologist working on different endangered and at-risk species to kind of really get down in the dumps
Yeah.
because you spend so much time and others spend so much time trying to recover populations and species, and then you might not move the needle. But I think I do have hope. What gives me hope is that they are so adaptable, but there's also so many incredible people working on salmon recovery and conservation. So many First Nations that are doing incredible Indigenous-led work through their Guardians programs, through big habitat restoration projects, through Indigenous-led governance and law and decision making. And there's a lot of international collaboration between the States and Canada and elsewhere. So I think the future for salmon, there will be a future, but it'll look different than today. Yeah.
Brilliant. Oh, that's a hopeful message.
Yeah. It's a hopeful and a little pragmatic.
Yeah, right. Well,
Sometimes the best you can do.
the only way to be, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Um, well, Kristen, this has been really interesting. Thanks very much for meeting me. I I'm pretty sure that my laundry's done. So I don't want to get it to get all creased. So I better
Mm,
attend to that. I hate that. I hate that. So I'm gonna go do it now.
yeah. That's a wise decision.
See you later.
Thanks, Lewis. Bye.
Bye. Well, well, well. Maybe I should do an episode on life in wells one day. I'm back in my kitchen sink. Maybe I should do an episode on life in sinks too. What marvellous creatures salmon are. I wish them all the best. Thank you, Kristen, for speaking with me, talking us through the complex lives of these unstoppable fish, and for painting such a vivid picture of British Columbian rainforests. Thanks to Damon Macmillan for the music, and thank you for listening. As ever, your support is greatly appreciated. No, it is. It really is, I tell you. We'll end now with a poem. This one's called Carnage. She lingers at the starting line within the Salish Sea, a Chinook salmon 1 metre long, weighing 25 kg. She's full to burst, and here because she's burgeoning with eggs. She's survived for years in open ocean, but right now the question begs, can she make it up the river where she'll spawn then die at peace? Or will she be someone's dinner before her eggs release? Thousands of these fish together wait in hesitation, postponing this next final step of their grueling migration. Ahead she lunges through cold water, the salmon all set sail. She passes through the jaws of a southern resident killer whale. She jumps up over black and white, the water below turns red, while in the air she sees a whale with salmon on its head. A dozen whales, in fact, a dozen carcasses as hats. A bloody little fashion show, and she notices that that's her good old friend, Deborah. The naughty whales have stole her. They fashioned poor old Debbie's corpse into a little bowler. And on another head she sees her old pal Nymphadora, who's been turned inside out and made into a crude fedora. This is fine, our salmon tells herself. Everything's fine, she narrates. She plops back into the water and wonders what fresh hell awaits. Zooming from the frenzy, with those debaucherous whales behind her, she's following her sense of smell which acts as her reminder, her guide to take her where she's going, the very same place she hatched. An olfactory system so keen it's pretty much unmatched. But there are some creatures out there which have also got strong noses, and she fears she might be seeing them before her journey closes. She's approaching now the river mouth, her eyes carefully prowling, but it's with her internal ears she notices a howling, a resonant and haunting sound, and though it makes her weary, she continues heading towards it because, according to her theory, her odds of passing on her genes beyond the howls are higher than if she stays here where it's safe. Well, here those odds are dire. So she passes through those howls in an act of great resistance, as mercifully those long howls fade off into the distance. Around a bend, up a waterfall, then round a meander. She can smell that that's the place to be, so her senses command her to exert herself in one final push, so upstream she goes, her last burst of energy against the water as it flows. A jump above the surface, a great ascent into the air. As she breaches from the water, she sees she's finally there. But she also sees carnage. About 20 hulking grizzly bears partaking in a brawl, each half a ton in weight and standing several meters tall, some scrapping with each other while others try to maul each fish that tries to make its way up this here waterfall. Running round between them, the howling now accounted for, a pack of coastal wolves, 10 at least, she could have counted more, dancing in a frenzy, ecstatic for their favourite dish, is being served in high supply, its fresh Pacific fish. Specifically, these clever wolves are just eating the brains, to avoid contracting parasites, so leaving the remains to be feasted on by a range of other woodland creatures, a coyote in the distance degrading one such salmon's features, and over by the forest a fish being dragged in, she'll assume a set of claws like that must belong to a great big puma. Remains upon remains there are, built upon the stones, a carpet of cadavers with piles of scales and eyes and bones. Crawling through the carcasses, hordes of flesh-devouring beetles, with swarms of flies and writhing mounds of worms as thin as needles. Above her are fish senses, an attack which feels illegal, as she's grasped at by the claws of an American bald eagle. The talons clutch around her as she's mere moments from landing. Her aerial assailant is set to take her, notwithstanding the fight which unfolds in the sky as the eagle is assaulted by many more sharp beaks, and so our lucky fish is jolted into lively, frothing, fertile water, landing with a splash. She's exactly where she wants to be, and though her body's trashed, she's made it. It's time to spawn, and out her eggs do flow, an outpouring of brand new life, an orange mass of roe. They're covered in the sperm of males who bless it with their milt. Her work is done, her mission's through, her body starts to wilt. Her organs fail, her thoughts slow down, her skin's peeling off and fungal. But she'll live on, she'll be absorbed by ancient temperate jungle.